All right, hello and welcome to a rather depressing third round of the Alicante Open. We played against a German player, Matthias Tondorf, and after kind of blundering out of the opening, honestly, I'm not sure if objectively the position really got that bad, but during the game it felt like I was just almost losing as early as like move 15. Um, we kind of crawled back into the game a bit. I'm not really sure where, to be honest. Maybe that means, I mean, that's why I thought maybe the position wasn't actually that bad the whole time, because at some point we definitely had the option to take a draw. And at that point, I think I got a little bit overambitious and managed to just like immediately checkmate myself. Obviously, credit to my opponent. He played a basically 100 accuracy game. Presumably, there's some mistake along the way, but other than that, in the brief glance that I did at the computer, every one of his moves was the top engine move. So, um, just a very very well played game by him. Nothing to really do sometimes. So let's jump in. My opponent played Sicilian, which I was expecting, but he played knight to c6, which I was not. He generally has played e6 over the years, so this marks the third time in 3 rounds that our opponents have surprised us on move 3 or earlier. I'm not sure why I bother preparing at this point. Apparently, we should just show up to the board. And in this game, I actually spent some time here because I wasn't sure what I wanted to play against knight c6 in general. Not just for this game, but as a more general opening repertoire question. The main moves, obviously, like most other Sicilians, are to play d4 and enter sort of the knight c6 variations of the open Sicilian, most notably the Sveshnikov. After cd, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight b5. This is a very solid reputation for black over the last few years. It's kind of unrealistic to win these positions with white more than like a few percent of the time. So against like a 2200, 2250 rated opponent, this would be like a perfectly fine choice, I think. You probably win like a quarter of the time, and that's like fine. But against a much lower rated opponent, it's just not really going to be acceptable. If they have like any, not even particularly deep, but really just any theoretical knowledge in the Sveshnikov, you're not likely to win many games. So the other main option that people have been turning to at the top level, at the lower level, like pretty much every level, is the Rosalima with bishop b5, mostly because it just keeps the game alive a little bit more. So especially playing against a lower rated player on paper, these are the types of openings you want to be going for. Ones that keep a lot of pieces on the board, ones that introduce a strategic imbalance like very, very early in the game. And so even though I don't have a lot of knowledge in the Rosalimo in general, I mean, I've looked at it, of course, like any main line, but not a ton. I think I only have maybe like 3 or 4 games in it in recent years, or classical games in it over the last few years. So definitely not like a comfort pick, but I thought it made sense for the tournament situation, which, as we talked about, was already a little bit in jeopardy. My opponent went for g6, which is the main line, and we traversed down the main line for at least a few moves. Here I went for a very early a4. I don't actually know, I haven't checked if this is the main move, but in general, the move order is not terribly important in the Rosalimo. This is one of the other reasons that it's a very, very popular choice. You can sort of play with ideas more than concrete lines. And one of the big ideas is to play a4, try to push this pawn kind of as far as it can go, often stopping at a5, but mostly just trying to interrupt black's queenside setup a bit. If we, for example, black plays a6, should be a very, very bad move, and white plays a5. Now the entire queenside is solidified forever. There's a very weak pawn on c5. It's almost reminiscent of like some Nimzo Indian type positions in reverse, where white is now very, very well prepared to go load up on this pawn. And if black doesn't play a6, instead plays like some normal move like knight to d7 intending e5, after a5 anyway, The queenside isn't totally resolved. Black is still able to play a move like b6 at some point, but not immediately because of the pin along the a file. So you kind of get a temporary version of the same concept where the c5 pawn is very weak, and if white is able to get to it very quickly before black is able to play something like rook b8 and b6, then white can generate some very, very serious pressure. And for that reason, or for some combination of those reasons, my opponent decided to play the move a5 immediately, which is a very violent solution to the a-pawn problem. Generally not the best way to handle it in the Rosalima, but the computer, again, in the brief glance that I did, rated this the best move, even though from a human perspective, it looks very, very bizarre to allow the queenside to be fixed in this manner. So I don't know if maybe my opponent was still in preparation here. Maybe he just, understood the position better. But in any case, a5 was played. So here I wasn't quite sure with the inclusion of a4, a5, what the exact correct setup for the pieces is. White would like to be able to get a knight to c4, either through a3 to c4 or d2 to c4. I wasn't sure if it really made much of a difference, to be honest. Either way, the knight needs to get there. But once the knight is on c4, it also needs to be able to stay there, which means we need to be able to prevent b5 from black once the knight is already planted on c4. The main way to do that is to generate pressure against the a-pawn, so that if, for example, we can imagine some kind of situation where a knight has made its way to c4, and, for example, the bishop is on d2, now black is unable to kick this knight away with b5 because the a5 pawn will be hanging. This is one indirect way that we try to get the knight there and sort of solidify it as an outpost. Another way is to generate pressure on the c5 pawn and argue that after b5, yes, you might manage to make the knight move. Let's say, for example, knight d7, bishop e3. I guess we should pretend this pawn is protected, so let's say, like, I don't know, h6 rook b1. And now the point is that after b5, yes, you make the knight move away, but this pawn on c5 is forever going to be weak because b6 will never be possible. Again, pawns don't go backwards. And if white is able, once again, to generate very, very quick pressure on this pawn, which in this particular position probably he isn't, but in general, there are some ideas with like knight d2, knight b3, maybe playing c3 to solidify some of these squares and trying to introduce the queen. It's a very, very deep strategic battle, but the point mostly is that it centers around white getting a knight to c4 as quickly and as stably as possible. So I decided to go for sort of the second option and try to introduce pressure on c5. Played the move bishop to e3. I was expecting knight d7, which is definitely the human move. Black is generally putting the knight in d7 in the vast majority of Rosalimo positions in order to defend against e5, in order to get out of the way for f5, to prepare e5 himself as well, prevent e5 from white. The knight is also very well placed on d7, where it defends the pawn on c5 in kind of like almost multiple ways. Like it very, very stably holds the entire construction together, because not only is it defending c5, it also defends the defender of c5 if black does play an eventual b6. Finally, the other reason the knight goes on d7 is that after black plays something like e5 and rook e8 to stabilize the center, the knight has a very comfortable route to the d4 square where it would be exceptionally well placed. So knight d7 almost always is played at some moment. I was even expecting it as early as after a4. Most human versus human games do involve knight d7 at some moment, so I was very surprised when my opponent played the move b6, once again allowing white to fix the queenside structure this early. Felt like during the game it should be slightly inaccurate. I mean, it can't obviously be that bad. Objectively, this is probably the structure that black will eventually get to, but allowing it to be set up so early with sort of no prospects of ever changing it felt a little like there should be some way to slightly punish it. Maybe in a very nuanced way, but there should be something. In hindsight, that was apparently over-optimistic. B6, once again, is the top engine recommendation, so I think that probably hurt me quite a bit for the remainder of the game, having spent or dedicated like quite a bit of time, honestly, in the opening to trying to exploit this move order, when in fact it was just the top computer line, even though there aren't really any human games in it. So here, this is the main point of the opening where I invested a lot of time. I wasn't quite sure how to set up the pieces. Once again, we need to get a knight to c4 in some fashion, either through a3 or through d2. I wasn't sure which route to take or if it really made a difference. So eventually I just played knight d2. But in hindsight, there are probably better options. There are a couple human games that go queen c1, which looks like a very odd move. It's something I considered during the game because, again, black, even though he's already played b6, probably is still going to play knight d7 at some moment to open up scope for the bishop, to prepare e5, to prepare rook e8, knight f8, like all of the things that we talked about. This is, again, the main reason I thought it was odd to start with b6 when it's basically guaranteed you're going to go for knight d7 at some point anyway. So queen c1 kind of preempts that by defending the pawn on d2, or on b2. Other than that, it doesn't. I didn't think it really had much of a purpose. We don't really want to play bishop h6 and trade these bishops, I didn't think. Maybe we do, and that's why the computer does like this move, but in general, I thought trading the dark square bishops felt a little bit strange in a position where black is most likely going to have almost all of his pawns on dark squares. This bishop is going to have very, very little scope. And my bishop on e3 is not that bad a piece. I mean, it's not like the greatest piece of all time or anything, but it is putting some pressure on black's queen side. It does support like c3 and d4 a little bit if we need to. If we do move this knight away and play f4, which is a very typical idea once black has landed a pawn on e5, then after something like takes, this bishop is going to be reasonably well placed on f4. So I didn't think that this would be a favorable exchange, but apparently queen c1 is both the human and computer move here. So knight d2 might have been a little bit inaccurate, and then probably it was a start of some problems. Here my opponent played bishop a6, which presumably was the point of starting with b6 instead of knight d7, was to preempt a knight coming to c4 by sort of defending that square immediately with the bishop. It's a very temporary construction. White will eventually obviously be able to put a knight on c4. It's not permanent just because there's a bishop there, but at least for now we can't go to c4 because the e4 pawn would be hanging. So this is where I spent kind of the rest of my time in the opening, which was a pretty big chunk of my overall time. There are a few ways to try to get a knight to c4 here. The most direct is just to play b3, intending to follow up with knight c4 in the next move, and if black then takes with the bishop, then we'd be very happy to recapture with the b pawn. We'd open up the b file for the rook to put pressure on b6 as well as the queen side. All of the pawns are going to be on light squares for white, so we'd be very, very happy to have the dark square bishops on. Overall, it's just not an exchange that black is going to make. But the downside of b3 is that it puts the rook immediately in the line of fire, and after knight d7, again, the move that we've been talking about for a few moves now, it's not really clear where we want to put this rook. After, for example, rook b1, the rook is definitely not really well placed. There's not like any sort of immediate concrete problem with it, but it's just kind of staring at nothing. It feels like a very substantial waste of a move. And so I was trying to avoid this. Rook a2 also possible. The main point of this is that we would be preserving the rook being on the a file. So again, we're putting indirect pressure on a5. This means the knight will be able to come to c4. After, for example, rook b1, e5, we can't even really go knight c4 because b5 immediately kicks it. This is one of the major downsides. So rook a2 is something worth considering. I didn't really give it all that much thought during the game. I thought this was probably just looks way too weird, to be honest. I didn't really have a concrete reason for judging the move other than that. But there's a decent chance that this is just fine. I mean, white will follow up with knight c4, continue on with standard stuff, and the rook on a2 may eventually rejoin the game for like c3, rook e2. I don't really, or rook d2, intending d4. Like there might be some purpose to the rook being on a2 eventually. It's just going to take a very, very long time. So I wasn't thrilled with the idea of b3, which means we were trying to find an alternative to get a knight to c4. So I did consider knight e5 for a while. Black will almost certainly respond with knight e4. This little tactical trick to try to pick up a pawn. And we start a slightly forcing line. After knight takes c6, we are hitting the queen, so black is forced to move the queen in a way that attacks the knight. And now we could take on e7 as like a desperado, but unfortunately b2 is falling at the end of the line, so this didn't look, particularly impressive. And if we just take on e4, then after black takes on c6, once again black is in no danger. In fact, probably black is much better with the two bishops in what is now a very, very open position. So unfortunately, knight e5 doesn't work either, which means, how do we actually get a knight to c4? Partially, this might be an indictment of the move knight d2. It might have been better to start with knight a3, intending after bishop a6 to bring the other knight to d2 so that it can support the knight coming to c4. Maybe this was a better plan. Objectively, I'm not sure it makes much difference, but it might have simplified my life a little bit. Again, f4 is also an idea that this produces. The knight on f3 was probably going to move anyway, so there's no real downside to it coming to d2. But with the knight already on d2, I eventually came up with a slightly odd idea to try to get a knight to c4, which is this very funny looking move, queen to b1. Now, the idea is pretty transparent. We're trying to bring the queen into the game via a2, where it will support the knight on c4. And the queen is also worming its way around to b3, where it will put some pressure on the b6 pawn, which is the base of black's queenside chain. So I thought this was an interesting move. It's an idea that comes mostly from some other openings. You'll see this in like the Philidor, some Italians, some like Pyrrhic structures that often have transposed into what looks like a Philidor, but not really in the Rossolimo. So while I was making this move, I was pretty sure that this probably wasn't going to be super correct, but it seemed reasonable in this particular position, so eventually I decided to go for it. My opponent played queen c7, which makes sense. Again, black is going to play e5 at some moment, so having the queen here to support it makes sense. This also opens routes for the rooks to get into the game. Connecting the rooks, always useful. And after queen a2, he played a very, very shocking move to me, which is this move knight to h5. So, I've mentioned several times now that the knight pretty much always goes to d7 in the Rossolimo, which I didn't think that this position should really be an exception. Again, the knight, very well placed on d7, controls pretty much every key square in black's formation. After the rook moves to e8 and e5 is played, it still has this route available to d4. Nothing has really changed with that. And in comparison, this knight on h5 does basically nothing. It doesn't really have any need to come to f4. It doesn't really do anything on f4. It's not really restricting white's play at all. Like, okay, sure, we can't play g3, but g3 was never going to be a move that we wanted to play in most positions anyway. So honestly, I'm not really sure what the purpose of this move was, and in the game I thought that this was probably an error, and like a pretty significant error. So I started to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to exploit it. Once again, as it turns out, knight h5 is the computer's first move. So this was probably like the third or fourth time in the game in just 12 moves that I wasted like a lot of time trying to refute a move that was just like objectively the best move. Why is still a mystery to me. I genuinely cannot explain this move. I have no idea why the computer likes it. It's going to be something that I'm going to have to take a look at much more deeply after the tournament, because this was clearly, like, this is clearly a weakness in my game if I can't even explain this move after the fact. Um, my opponent was still moving very quickly at this point as well, so I don't know. Maybe this is still in his preparation, which would be very surprising because, again, we've played this very unusual maneuver, queen b1 to a2. Possibly this is still in his preparation, and like this queen b1, in some way that would be an endorsement of my queen b1 a2 idea, so I would be sort of happy about that at least. But possibly also, I mean, this was just over the board inspiration once again. Like, this is just a position that my opponent has like very, very, very deep understanding of, and I do not. So after, the question on my mind in the game, because again during the game I thought knight h5 was a mistake, was okay, how do I actually exploit this? Well, there are two ways to try to exploit it. One is to argue, okay, the knight is not on d7, so we can go put more pressure on the queen side than we usually would be able to. The problem with this approach is that the queen side is very, very difficult to access in this particular position. We can do the idea we talked about with queen b3, knight c4, put pressure on the b6 pawn, but it's not really a lot of pressure. Black will be able to just play rook b8 and hold the position together pretty much always, and there's not really any way to increase the pressure once black does that. So it's an idea that we should keep in mind, trying to pressure the queen side a little bit, but it's not by itself going to exploit the fact that the knight is on h5. The other way to argue that the knight shouldn't be on h5 is to argue that, okay, the knight on h5 is actually vulnerable to attack. It's not so much about the knight isn't where it's supposed to be, it's that it's in an actively bad position. And the way to try to exploit that would be to play g4 at some point when the knight is not able to just sort of quote-unquote correct its mistake. Again, in the game I thought it was a mistake, and just go back to f6. But instead do it at a moment when it's forced to go to f4, which would be fine except for the fact that after, for example, if black has a pawn on e5, after takes this pawn on f4, it would become a very, very, very big target. So this is the plan that I was trying to go for, was some way to play g4 at a moment when we can force black to bring a pawn to f4, and then we'll have very, very big control of the center. Black will have a weak pawn on f4. The pieces on the queen side are now going to be out of the game. Should be all very, very good things. And so this is what I did. I went for rook a e1 first. This basically forces black to play e5, because if black doesn't play e5, we are now ready to. I did consider playing e5 immediately, which would be a little bit of a pawn sacrifice. The idea being that after takes, bishop h6, rook somewhere, probably d8. The other rook comes to e1. Now, we do have, in compensation for the pawn, strong control over the e-file, an active bishop compared to black's in an opposite color bishop position where we are starting to generate the makings of an attack. If the queen goes back to d6, then white has a few ideas. One is to sort of bring the queen to c3, try to start exploiting the dark squares. Another is to bring the knight into the game via e4 and g5. But I ended up rejecting this because I thought that after queen d5, worst case, this is pretty much forcing the queens off in a way that also corrects the structure for black. And even though white is a little more active here, this shouldn't be any kind of serious advantage. It probably is zero advantage, in fact. Most likely this is just liquidating to a draw, like, immediately. So rook e1 was an attempt to prepare that. If we are able to play e5, then black is no longer able to take it because of the same idea with bishop h6, which would now be a discovered attack. This means that black is basically obligated to play e5 himself, and this is a moment where I can consider the move g4. If black is forced to play knight f4, then white has gotten everything he wanted. We have a weak pawn on f4. We have big control of the center. Black's pieces are out of play. It's all very, very good. But I didn't consider this that deeply because we didn't fulfill the first part of the plan, which was to force the knight to go to f4. And I thought after the knight returns to f6, then we've just weakened our kingside for no apparent reason. Not only have we weakened our kingside for no apparent reason, we've chased the knight back to its better square. You know, we've again let black correct his mistake. So instead I play knight c4. This is trying to increase the pressure on e5, which would be relevant because now after g4, knight f6 is not possible. I was expecting to move rook to e8 so that after g4, black is able to go back to f6. But instead my opponent played a very mysterious looking move, h6. I didn't really understand the point of this during the game that much. I mean, I understood vaguely what black was going for, but it felt very strange to me. Again, computer taught move, so this is now like the 5th time in the game I tried to refute something that is just correct, so yet another misjudgment of the position. This does allow white to play his idea by forcing the knight to go to f4 and exchanging it off. But the problem that I overlooked here is that after e5, which would be almost winning, I think, under most circumstances, a knight is coming to d6. We are prepared to put pressure on f4. Black's pieces are just completely sidelined here. We're also able to play e6 sometimes, try to blow open black's king. Like, it's a very, very, very comfortable position for white. I think probably almost winning, if not for this very, very simple but strong idea that I overlooked, which is the honestly very obvious move, bishop to c8, which completely kills any ideas that white has. Now e6 is not possible. Rook e4 is almost never going to be possible because bishop e6, d5 comes very, very quickly. Other than that, there's really not much else to speak of, and knight d6 is never going to be possible because black will always be able to just round up the e5 pawn if we abandon the defense a bit. For example, in this position, after knight d6, bishop e6, queen b1, bishop d5, attacking the knight, the last defender of e5 is removed and white can pretty much resign. So after bishop c8, I realized that white is probably not better at all. This sort of whole plan has failed, and in fact white has assumed quite a lot of risk because, again, we have weakened our kingside and not gotten a lot in return. So if we wanted to win this game, which obviously we do, this is, as we talked about, basically going to be a must-win game for the rest of the tournament, and especially now given today's result. If we want to have any hope of winning this game, we need to sort of fundamentally change the character of the position, because right now there is very, very few active plans for white, and black has a very, very, very solid position. And so the idea that I came up with to try to do this was to, first of all, bring the queen back into the game. Queen b3 forces rook to b8. I say forces, but black can also play the move b5. Which I thought was possible. Or wait, sorry, the move bishop to e6. Maybe b5 is also possible now that I say it. That's not really the move I was considering during the game, but b5 could actually be kind of interesting. This does look like a kind of powerful pawn sacrifice. But the main thing I was going to say was bishop e6 is also possible. Sacrificing the b pawn temporarily, but regaining it very, very quickly. And then I wasn't quite sure how to evaluate this endgame. On the one hand, black's rook is very, very active, and is probably going to munch a lot of pawns on white's queen side. On the other hand, black is very much playing without one of his pieces, and so white probably has, well, definitely has a lot of counterplay. I'm just not sure if it's supposed to be any kind of advantage for white, or if it's just enough to hold the balance. Most likely just enough to hold the balance, but I was pretty okay going into this endgame because I figured that at least we have like something to work with, you know. The goal once we miss bishop c8 is much less to find like the objectively best move, because the objectively best move is just going to lead to a draw, and probably a draw that we're on the worst side of, but to just find a way to change the character of the position into something more double-edged. So queen to b3 does not force rook to b8, but that is what my opponent played. It's also what I was expecting. I mean, going into the other end game is a little scary when you have the stable option, so rook to b8 makes a lot of sense. Queen to c3. I was much more concerned with the move h5 here. I was actually very surprised my opponent played bishop to e6. This is one of the few moves, or well, I guess one of the two moves that the computer is slightly critical of, though it does think they're basically the same evaluation. In the game, I was much more scared of h5 because I thought this pretty much forced knight h2 to try to defend the g4 pawn, and the knight becomes sidelined. Now, if black wants to play bishop e6, he can do it. He could also trade and play bishop e6 first. You basically get the same position, but the knight has been forced to slide back. I'm not really sure why he didn't do this, to be honest. The computer finds some, frankly, crazy defenses that involve just sacrificing exchange here, like taking on h5, taking on h3, and playing a move like queen to d2, and basically says that white is doing okay here, even more than after bishop e6. So maybe my opponent saw this and was scared of this. Maybe he had some other reason. I don't know. But he ended up playing bishop e6, which not quite the best move, but very, very, very close. Basically the same, close enough to the same evaluation that it's just a matter of taste of which like marginally better position black wants to take. Something that's probably up material for a little bit of insufficient, like not quite sufficient compensation, or this much more standard safe option. And so in this position, this is where I did something a little bit violent, which is the move d4. Obviously not a move that white is very, very happy to play. Blowing open the position when black has two bishops, correcting the damage structure on black's queen side. Both very, very severe negatives. You know, normally I would go on and on about like the weaknesses of the move, but that kind of sums it up. You only really need those two. There's not really any need to add anything else on. But it does complicate the game. It does activate the pieces a little bit. It does at least give white like the makings of a plan, if not exactly a plan itself. So I thought that, I mean, as a winning attempt, this is probably the best we're going to do, even though it's a very, very risky move, and probably objectively black is getting some advantage here. So my opponent surprised me here with the move bishop to d5. I thought this was very strange because I was expecting black to take first, and only then, after white recaptures either with the knight or the queen, I'm not really sure which, only then to play bishop d5, which seems like a strictly better version. And this is a move that the computer does agree is a strictly better version. Bishop d5 was my opponent's only inaccuracy of the game. So at this point I started to feel like, okay, at least my plan has succeeded. We have managed to change the character to position. I don't think I'm better, but it's at least something. We've managed to create some chances using what's basically a bluff. But this ray of hope was kind of extinguished pretty quickly. We played b3, rook to b4. This is aimed at defending the a5 pawn, which at the moment can't be taken because f3 is hanging, but white is going to play knight d2 at some point anyway, so rook to b4 is a very sensible just preempting of that situation. I do go ahead and play knight d2 here. This has a few ideas. We'd like to bring a knight to e4 in some circumstances. Trying to go to d6, maybe going to f6, trying to relieve some of the pressure of the two bishops. It also gets the knight out of the way of the attack on the bishop from the bishop, which means the queen is a little bit freer to move. And it also defends the knight on c4, which is now very stably positioned. So all in all, just a very useful multi-purpose move. The downside, of course, is that we lose a defender of the e5 pawn, and we're also moving further away from the king side, where we've severely extended ourselves in the hopes of generating some kind of play. So in this position, I spent most of my time looking at the move rook to e8, which I think is by far the most natural move for black, just increasing the pressure on the e5 pawn that has just lost a defender. In fact, white really has no constructive plan here. I spent a very, very long time trying to come up with something and honestly just couldn't. The main point here is that knight d6 is pretty much just losing to rook takes e5. And after rook takes e5, queen takes d6, rook to e8, king to h7. White is basically just lost. The two bishops are extremely powerful. More than compensates for the exchange, and white is very, very likely to just get mated on the king side in short order. So if not knight d6, it's really not clear what white does. Probably we're going to have to double on the e-file, even though the rooks don't do anything here, just to try to overprotect this pawn. Importantly, f6 looks like it would just win the game here, but I think white is getting away with queen d3, stepping out of the pin and attacking g6 instead. So I think black would probably play a move like rook to e6, and after rook to e1, any move, probably queen to e7, for example, trying to head to h4 and do some damage on the king side, but realistically neither side has an obvious plan here, so it's not really clear to me how either player is making progress. But my opponent instead played what I thought during the game was an odd move with rook to d8, yet again just very, very computer approved, but in the game I thought that this was an opportunity. And the main reason that I thought it was an opportunity was that because black hasn't put as much pressure on the e5 pawn as he would with rook e8, this knight is now free to move and try to reposition itself to allow this knight to come to c4. Right now we have the sort of classical superfluous knights thing where both knights would like to be on c4, but only one is legally allowed to be there. So white would like to play a move like knight b2, get out of the way for this knight to come to c4, maybe bring the other knight to d3, where it puts pressure on c5. In principle, this makes a lot of sense positionally. And this is the move that I ended up playing. The reason that rook to d8 specifically invites this move is that normally, after queen to e7, again aiming for the king side, knight to d3, black would have the move rook to d4, just keeping these knights at bay by just thrusting the knight into the rook into the center of the board. And the idea is that this pawn on c5 is immune, because after takes, the knight on d2 is hanging, and if white tries to take it with the knight, then once again this knight is hanging to this sort of mild tactic that achieves two very, very powerful bishops, which are easily outclassing a rook. But in this position, specifically with the rook on d8 and not anywhere else, white has one more move at the end of the line with c4, which regains a piece due to the pin on the d file. If the rook were somewhere like b8 or f8, like if it hadn't moved at all, then this would not be at all concerning, but with the rook specifically on d8, this is now an idea. So I thought during the game that rook d8 specifically invites knight to b2, which is what I played. This is also possibly why my opponent played rook to d8, because as it turns out, knight to b2 is a very, very critical blunder that basically decides the game on the spot. So now after queen e7, knight to d3, black reveals the point, which is that the idea is not rook to d4, which would indeed just allow white to take the pawn on c5 very comfortably, but instead to sacrifice the exchange with the move queen to h4, after which the game is just completely over. White has no way to defend against all of the threats on the king side. I did go ahead and take the rook. This is probably not the best, but I thought during the game I thought this was the only way to hope. If we're going to get mated, let's at least get mated for an exchange, because that way if we don't get mated, we at least have something to speak of. But after takes queen d3, black has a number of ways to conclude the game. The fanciest that I saw was the move bishop to h1. Now if white goes ahead and directly takes the rook, then black is just winning a lot of material and easily winning the game. So white instead has to insert the move knight to f3. This would also be the case if black played like bishop e6 or something, just intending to sacrifice on g4. White would have to insert this intermezzo knight f3, which in this case would save the game. But after bishop h1, knight f3 is insufficient. After queen takes h3, we do get to take the rook with check, but there's not any way to defend against the mate on g2 for more than a move. We can play knight h4, which defends the square temporarily, but after f3, bishop to g2 and queen h1 is completely unstoppable, and white can resign. But my opponent instead went for the sort of much more prosaic way to win with h5. Again, in the game I thought this was giving me at least some chance, because bishop h1 like just forces resignation on the spot, but h5 at least it's like white gets to continue the game. But you know, once again, I was mistaken. The computer approves of h5 even more than bishop h1. Like it thinks h5 is so good that even though bishop h1 wins a queen for no compensation, h5 is even better. So I found probably the only real practical defense, I think. This is what I was anticipating, but this is giving away a lot. After h takes g4, we play the move knight to e4. Now there are again many ways for black to end the game. Probably by far the simplest is to give this check, which my opponent played, and after king g2 just to take on e4 directly. White is forced to recapture, and after queen h3, king g1, bishop f8, I just resign. There's no way to stop the bishop coming to c5 again for more than a move. Rook to d2 is coming. Everything is completely collapsing. So I was about ready to resign when my opponent instead played the move queen to h3 here, which I thought, okay, I mean, I guess like this is technically a new lease on life. I don't get to resign just yet. Once again, you're never going to guess what happened. This is a computer top move. I did not, in fact, actually have any hope here. So king to g1, my opponent just took on e5. Again, I thought very strange, like, why are we going pawn grabbing when we're just giving checkmate? But, you know, it's just once again correct. And the point is that white is just going to get mated eventually. You don't need to do it immediately. You can do it now. You can do it later. It's all a matter of taste. Computer's taste is to do it later. Human's taste probably to do it now. But I mean, my opponent's taste was to do it later. So I played rook to e2, only attempt at a defense, and my opponent played the line that he presumably calculated, which was to conclude the game with this kind of nice move, king to g7, just intending to bring the rook around to the h-file, and white has no defense because after rook h2, which is the only way to defend the h-file, black would conclude the game with the very nice move bishop to c4. This is like sort of a pin on the queen, and if we end up taking it, then this rook falls and we also get mated. But even worse, the rook falls. So probably this was calculated as far back as you know, playing h5 instead of bishop h1, I guess. So like a much like a very, very nice way to end the game. Honestly, I nothing really to say. You know, you have to give props to the opponent. They played fantastically. I don't think I made it very difficult for them, or certainly not as difficult as it should have been. So I'm not really happy with the quality of my play. But really, really nice game from the opponent. I would be very proud to have this from the black side. Sometimes all you can do is just, you know, watch as your position crumbles to pieces. I remember there was some, I don't remember where this was, probably on Reddit or something, but I remember somebody posted something along the lines of like, is it worth it to become a chess grandmaster? And it's a question that I thought about a lot myself, especially as we go on this journey to what's hopefully grandmaster, but as you know, I have acknowledged in myself and hopefully publicly. I mean, I don't know if I actually talk about it that much, but this is going to be like very, very unlikely, maybe impossible at the stage we're at. And so a very reasonable question to ask is, okay, like, why are we doing this? Is it worth it even if we succeed? And I remember somebody posted in response to this, basically making the argument that, not really. Chess is often just an exercise in just kind of self-masochism and depression. And one of the things they observed was it said something along the lines of like the worst thing in chess isn't blundering or like losing a winning position or even like flagging on in like a completely reasonable position or like doing forfeiting, like whatever. Like the worst thing in chess is when you're going to lose, like your position is unsalvageable, but it's going to be slow. And you just have to kind of sit there and watch your position deteriorate before your eyes. And there's nothing you can do to stop it, but it's not quite bad enough for you to resign just yet. So you have to continue. And then at the end of this, you try to defend this for like 3, 4, or 5 hours. In your heart of hearts that like it's never going to happen, but 1 in 1,000 times it might happen. So you have to play it out anyway. And then 999 times out of 1,000 it doesn't happen, and you have to then go home and drive like an hour back to your home often, with how remote tournaments, especially in the US, are. And like the whole time you're like, I could have been doing anything else with my time. Like why did I choose to dedicate like a full day to this? I don't remember if the post was like trying to be optimistic or realistic or pessimistic or not, whatever. But I definitely felt this way during this game. So for quite a lot of it, honestly, because at some point, really even early on after I missed bishop c8, I kind of felt like there was a very, very high chance that I was going to lose the game. I knew I had to try. Like I can't afford to draw the game, so we have to take a lot of risk, and that comes with risk, but sort of by definition comes a very, very high chance of losing. And I very much felt like with how well my opponent played that I was just kind of a passenger to this game. Like I was just sitting there and waiting to lose, and there was no doubt in my mind that it was going to happen. So the last like 2 hours of the game, I was mostly not even really calculating. You'll probably notice in this video I gave very, very few variations because there wasn't really anything to calculate. I'm just kind of sitting there lamenting my life. So it was a very, very unpleasant loss to take, especially at the beginning of this journey. But the conclusion that I came to after thinking about this for a while is that, look, this is step one of what I know is going to be a very, very long journey. If I do make Grandmaster from here, which, again, very unlikely, maybe impossible, but not 100% impossible. But in any case, it's going to be a very, very long journey, and this is just step one. So it really sucks to have what is not only a bad performance like early in step one, but something that guarantees that the rest of this tournament is going to be a slog and mostly just trying to limit the damage. Like there really is nothing worse. But if we can get through this, we can get through anything. Is the optimistic conclusion that I eventually came to. And thinking back to this question of is it worth it? I don't know, honestly, and maybe I will never know, but I don't think I cannot try. I would much more regret not trying than I would trying and failing, even if it's failing very, very spectacularly as is going on in this tournament. If a year from now I'm 2300, which at this point is looking quite likely, and can't perform like even remotely at any title player level, let alone Grandmaster, like I would still sleep better at night, knowing that I at least gave it an attempt. The worst thing to do is not try. So I'm going to try to keep telling myself that for the rest of the night, because if not, I'm going to go absolutely fucking crazy. And we will be back tomorrow for round 4, where, if that one doesn't go well, I'm probably not going to come back with an optimistic message tomorrow. But we will try to limit the damage. There are still 6 rounds left in the tournament. It is still obviously theoretically possible to mount a comeback and at least even things out. Obviously, this is not going to be a good tournament, but by any means, that ship has long since sailed. But it is possible to make a little bit of a comeback, try to end the tournament, losing just like 5 or 10 rating and not like 15 and 20, whatever. It's very important in chess that when things are going poorly, you're clearly not playing your A game. But it's very important to make sure that your B or even your C game are at least okay. Like you're not always completely collapsing. So we're gonna try to prove that we can do that. Not the skill that I was hoping to try out this tournament, but a skill nonetheless, and one that we will need to develop along the way. So going to do that, and I will see you all tomorrow morning for round 4. Thank you for watching this mostly rambling depresso video.